Hello, my name is Matthew Horne. I'll be presenting on HR 516, the Environmental Justice Mapping and Data Collection Act of 2021. I wanted to start by thanking my Alpha team, Mike Becker and Dan Coleman, for all of their help, as well as the rest of my workshop group for their support, and our brilliant advisor, Professor Rosen. For this presentation, I'll begin with an introduction to the bill, followed by an overview of the problem and the science behind the problem. We'll dive into a few case studies, and then I'll discuss the future directions for this issue and summarize the impacts of the bill. The Environmental Justice Mapping and Data Collection Act of 2021 was introduced by Congresswoman Cori Bush this January and begins by defining an environmental justice community as a community with significant representation of communities of color, low-income communities, or tribal and indigenous communities that experiences or is at risk of experiencing higher or more adverse human health or environmental effects as compared to other communities. With this working definition, the bill will establish a committee led by the Environmental Protection Agency, which will gather and maintain data relating to socioeconomic factors, pollution and public health, to create a nationwide map which will be able to connect communities to relevant investments. To provide some background on the environmental justice movement, this is not a recent issue, and these communities have often been fighting for their rights for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But the modern environmental justice movement that has led to this bill mostly started to arise in the 1960s when we see small-scale protests to large waste management projects. As a result, by the 1980s, we had seen established not in my backyard policies where wealthier and wider communities had enacted policy prohibiting the placement of toxic waste sites and land management sites in their immediate vicinity, which resulted in Black community leaders organizing and beginning to protest and seeing this movement on a national scale. And then in 1987, the Racial Justice Report concluded that the positioning of hazardous facilities in communities of color was not coincidental, but the result of these local and federal policies. It wasn't until 1994 that President Clinton signed Executive Order 12A98, which was the first federal action towards environmental justice that required federal agencies make environmental justice part of their mission. Seeing as that was relatively broad, in the decades since, environmental groups are still underfunded and still lacking the political power necessary to change the systems that have resulted in these environmental justices and may continue to result in these environmental justices. For example, zip code is still the greatest predictor of long-term health. Race is still one of the most powerful predictors of access to healthy food, which is only exacerbated by the recent pandemic. And kids in Flint, Michigan still have lead in their water, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. The major environmental hazards that the bill is going to be looking at include air pollution, water pollution, soil pollution, and climate change. So we're going to be talking about those in a little bit more detail. For air pollution, we're going to focus on particulate matter as it has extreme effects on human health, which are fine particles smaller than 2.5 micrometers that are suspended in the air from emissions, dust, smoke, which can lead to aggravated lung disease, asthma, and inflammation. And from the environmental justice perspective, Black Americans are exposed to 21% more particulate matter pollution than white Americans. For water pollution, you find heavy metals, chemicals, fertilizer, oil, and more in water as a result of sewage, agricultural production, oil spills, and leakage. These chemicals can result in cell decay, diarrhea, decreased muscle and bone growth, with tens of thousands of individuals dying every day around the world due to complications originating from water pollution. And a violation of water systems regulations are 40% more likely to occur in the US in communities with majority of people of color. For soil pollution, we find a lot of those same chemicals that are in water pollution, but are resulting from improper or failed management of toxic waste, which can lead to cancers, leukemia, and nervous system damage. And we find that the majority of people living less than 2 miles away from toxic waste facilities are people of color. Lastly, the effects of climate change, including increased frequency and intensity of extreme weather events caused by industrial emissions, deforestation, permafrost thawing. Particularly impacts we see are sea level rise for marginalized communities, as well as property damage and migration. This photo illustrates the Kenal Indian Nation in Washington State, which has had to move from their ancestral home due to rising sea levels. Now that we've established some of the science behind the issue, I wanted to cement the connection between socioeconomic class and environmental effects with 2 case studies. Beginning with Katrina. Katrina was a massive hurricane that hit the southeastern United States in 2005, resulting in billions of dollars of property damage and serious flooding in New Orleans. Looking at these 2 maps here, on the left, we see the racial demographics in New Orleans, where the greener dots represent Black communities and the orange dots represent white communities, each dot representing 5 people. And then in that same area on the right, we see increased levels of flooding, with the warmer, darker colors representing higher levels of flooding, with the cooler, lighter colors representing low levels of flooding. As we can see, the areas most strongly impacted were those that were predominantly Black communities, given that they didn't have the resources available before the hurricane to upgrade their levee infrastructure, resulting in much worse flooding in these areas. And even following the hurricane, that same issue of lack of resources has contributed to these communities having a much more difficult time rebuilding and reestablishing their communities in the wake of the hurricane. Even 15 years have passed, these communities haven't fully recovered in comparison to the bounce back we've seen from the white communities in New Orleans. Next, I want to talk a little bit about Flint, Michigan, where in 2014, the city changed their water supply in efforts to save money. But the difference in water composition resulted in significant lead leaching. We had complaints around water color, odor, with a lot of people reporting rashes due to the water. And as we can see here, Flint is a predominantly low-income community. The map on the left indicating median household income, with the majority of the community having median household incomes of below 40,000. As you can see, the lighter colors represent lower incomes, the darker colors representing higher incomes. And then on the right, the darker red areas indicate the communities that were most impacted by the leaching. And we can see that the lower income members of the community, even in this region, were more strongly impacted than the wealthier communities, just because Flint didn't have access to a lot of political and economic resources before the switch. So their water systems had been outdated, and even now trying to improve those systems has proved especially difficult for these communities. Discussing the kind of the specifics about lead levels in Flint, kids were, before the water switch, children already had, there's 2.5% of children had elevated levels of lead in their blood, and after the switch, nearly 5% of children had elevated levels of lead in their blood, with only 1% of children in the surrounding areas exhibiting high levels of lead, both before and after the switch, illustrating the failed system that contributed to these children being exposed to higher amounts of lead. I just wanted to wrap up by again indicating how important this map is to these communities, because it will not only identify them at a national scale, which we currently don't have any national method of doing so, and then bring them to the decision table so they can create equitable development for the future. Thank you, and I'll take any questions.
Yeah, first of all, you referenced some DEI aspects of this legislation. As I understand it, there are plenty of indigenous folks who live on and use the land. So I'm just wondering, how would the impact them?
So Seth's question was, how will this affect tribal and indigenous communities specifically? Is that correct? So as we can see from the example, a lot of tribal and indigenous communities are most strongly impacted by climate change given the areas they're in. And with this bill, the map will help identify them on a national scale, which will enable them to apply for funding, which we can see is already being set aside in the majority of bills that are being introduced, as the ones we talked about today, which already have 40% allocated towards these communities. So being able to be identified by this bill as targeted communities makes them more eligible for that relevant investment.
Could you explain the water source switch a little more in Flint?
Yes, so in Flint, they changed their water source to a local river in an attempt to save money than bringing water from further away as they were currently doing. The changing in water composition though from the river to their original source led that water to contribute to a significant amount of lead leaching in the pipes, which then increased the amount of lead exposure that children and individuals were facing in the Flint community.
So does this plan plan to have a user friendly interface on the website or something like that that is accessible to public access?
Yeah, so the question was, does this bill create an interface that is accessible to communities so they can utilize this data? And yes, the bill is tasked with establishing a data repository that is accessible to local, regional, federal, and indigenous communities so that they can visualize and use this data to apply for relevant federal investments. They did have some concerns about how aggregated data is because they don't want individuals to be identified, but still using that data, they should be able to identify themselves as environmental justice communities in terms of accessing then relevant federal funds.
Are you redefining the definition of impact? What are the boundaries of impact within the region? Or are you already following the
Right, so this bill is especially important in that right now, despite a lot of environmental justice language and a lot of policies around the US, there's no current nationwide standard for what that means for a community, and it makes it harder for these communities to access resources even when they're set aside specifically for them. And so by providing a workable definition and identifying these communities on a national scope, it'll help these communities to then access these resources available to them. So in providing the definition, it's primarily just to create a threshold that can be used across the country.
Yeah, I was curious about, you mentioned soil pollution as one of the causes of cancer like leukemia. I was wondering how the soil pollution actually affected communities through direct exposure.
Yeah, so Matt's question was how soil pollutants interact with the community in order to expose them to these pollutants. I'm not sure all of the effects, but one of the ones that we found in our research is that as these pollutants enter the soil, nearby communities, they are brought up a lot in dust from wind erosion. And so, especially if individuals are outside, they are prone to more likely interact with these contaminants.
So obviously the EPA or collects a lot of data on pollution, climate movement through collects a lot of data on racial makeup in areas. So like theoretically, you could just put those two data sets together and make something similar. So why is this particular map necessary beyond data that we're already collecting?
Okay, so the question was, given that a lot of this data is already readily available and being used by the EPA and contributed by the Census Bureau, why is this not necessary? And that is a great question because the EPA does already have some GIS examples of maps that you can use to layer these specific variables. But this bill is necessary in providing that working definition across the country and providing a multi-bureau committee, which then contributes to this map on a variety of different levels, making these funds more accessible to these communities because they're already connected to the relevant bureaus, whether that's energy, health and human services, commerce, that they might be trying to seek funds for. They're already included in the committee and therefore will be easier to address and access.
Thank you very much.